the wonderful invitation and opportunity to share tonight. I'm really humbled that people would want to come. Actually, oftentimes when people write dissertations, there are these 400 or 500 pages that are committed to sit on a shelf for hundreds of years and never be read, and to be able to have something and have it published and have people think it might have possibly something to say for them is really overwhelming. So what I'd like to do tonight is share a little bit about why I wrote it, where it came from, why it's important to me. And then what I'd like to do, given the fact that I realize probably most of the folks here have not read it yet, or if you have, you started and you probably stopped after a few pages. And so what I'm hoping to do is give you a chance to kind of frame, give you a big picture of the book and the argument and some of the things that are going on inside of it. And then I would love to hear some of your questions, thoughts, concerns towards the end of that. So when I started to write and thinking about these questions, there were really three main questions, three problems that really where this book kind of started to circulate around. The first problem was the question, how did this happen? My body, my person. And what I mean by this is, from the time I was really little, I was always struck by the best way to describe it is a kind of double take look. So I'm walking through the mall with my mom, and then somebody says, "Oh, what a cute child!" And they look at me, and they look at my mom, and they look back at me, and they say, "Is it yours?" And she's like, "Well, yes, of course." And I'm just like, what is going on here? And then I'm thinking more about it. I'm like, well, as I got a little bit older, I came to realize that my mother was a white mother of a dark child. She was the mother of a black child. And she had no idea when she fell in love with this black man in the late 60s, early 70s about what in the world this would look like. And so the more I began to think, I was like, well, how in the world does a white woman come to love a dark man? How is it that a dark man comes to love a white woman in a world, a society, where literally 97% of all children born are of one race? How in the world, what happens there? But even in the midst of that, what is the classification? What is the system of classification that suggests that my mother, married to a black man, can only give birth to black babies? Why is it that a black woman can never give birth to a white child? What kind of world do we exist in? What kind of work is race doing in the world that creates those kinds of impossibilities? So that was the first question that I began to wrestle with. The second question I began to wrestle with was when I became a Christian and started to study theology and become really enamored with theology. The sad fact is that when I became a Christian, it didn't affect my racial imagination whatsoever. I worshipped in a white church, mostly because there were no churches with mixed folk in them. They were always one or the other. So choosing church was literally a kind of continuation of this problem of having to choose races. And so Christianity it did not inform my racial identity at all. I still felt in between, I still felt unsettled. And yet, when I became a Christian, when I started studying theology, I came across a quote, a tiny little passage from a 2nd century letter, tiny little letter. And it literally rang inside of me. It read in this way. It says, Christians... Oh, too fast. Okay, here we go. It says, Christians live in their own countries, but only as aliens. They share in everything as citizens. They endure everything as foreigners. Every foreign land is their fatherland. And yet for them, every fatherland is a foreign land. And here I thought, oh my God, they are talking about my existence, about my life. And yet rather than this being a problem, Instead of this being something to overcome, this is the point of the Christian life. To be unsettled. I have to find out why this is the case. Why is this the case? Because Jesus created new creatures. Jesus made something different. So I began to think more and more about how is it that theology helps us to articulate our identities, articulate our lives inside of Jesus' life. Lastly, the third question has to do with Jesus himself. And really, it wasn't so much my question as it was Mary's question. Mary's question was very simple. How can this be? How can this be? How can God come to exist inside of me? How can God come to us in this way? How could God become a child, remain God, and yet succumb to a womb, to birth, to despair? How can this be? And so the book really centers around these three questions. About our own racial existence, about the identity of what it means to be a Christian, and the identity of who Jesus is, and why those things make a difference. So the book, in a sense, there's three parts. The first is renunciation, the second is confession, the third is immersion. Each section of the book is a kind of reflection upon a birth. The reflection upon the birth of a child and how the world receives that child. The first section is the birth of a mulatto child. Of what does it mean? How did this child even come to be identified in this way? The second reflection is the birth of Jesus himself. In Mary's refrain, how can this be? And how did the church understand who this person was? How did the disciples understand who this was? And then thirdly, our own birth up through the baptismal waters. What does it mean for us to say that when we come out of the water wet, we are reborn? So it follows these three. I really wanted the book to be named What Child Is This? But the publisher said no. So you gotta do what the publisher says. So Redeeming Mulatto is as good as any. So what child is this is kind of the refrain throughout the text. And so what I want us to think a little bit about tonight is this idea of what is it that theology does? What is the theology supposed to do? And so this is a kind of underlying idea, and that is oftentimes we think of theology as these big, abstract, philosophical ideas that how can we figure out who God is, what God's name is, what's truth, and what should we believe in, and what should not believe in. Part of what the underlying conviction of this book is that theology is ultimately about our bodies. It is ultimately about our lives together. And why do I make that claim? Because, in fact, God is about a body. Jesus' body. So at no point can theology ever disentangle nice and neatly metaphysical, philosophical ideas of truth from actual flesh and fleshly realities. We must always be thinking these things together. And so this book is an attempt to do that. So why theology of a mixed person? Why these identities? Well, one of the things that we begin to understand with race, one of the curiosities about the mulatto, the mixed person, is that they occupy a very strange space in especially American history, but I think in the kind of encounter between Europe and the world. That is to say, when they were bringing soldiers and Bibles and guns, they also brought slaves. And they met interesting people there. And to put it bluntly, people got busy. Yes, people got busy. And babies were born, strange babies. And the question becomes, how do we classify these children? And so the word mulatto is like literally, its closest derivation is literally mule, a hybrid of two beasts, right? It is a kind of not quite this, not quite that. And it derives mostly out of the Spanish kind of They were lovely at making names and classifying things. And they had this really crazy, a really wide system.